Do you constantly feel like you're disappointing your friends and family as a person? If you answered yes, then you can continue that disappointment by skipping out on your Minecraft City Skyline. Or you can watch this video and then I can show you all the tips and tricks. We'll talk about the concepts, we'll check out some real life cities so that you know I'm not just making all of this up, and then we'll check out some Minecraft examples as well. First of all, we're going to talk about tall building locations. Where do you actually put them? That's very important. Second, we're going to talk about the variation in building height. Do you make all of your buildings tall, all of them short? The answer is no. How do you mix all the buildings together so that it looks good and cohesive? Then we'll talk about the geometric shape of your buildings. Should you have angular pointed buildings, rectangular, or maybe they should be a little bit more circular? After that, we're going to talk about some special buildings to spice up your skyline, make it look interesting so that it's not just skyscrapers. Nobody wants to see that. We'll talk about nature, how you can incorporate trees, your landscape, and even water into your design as well. Then we'll talk about skyscraper spacing, how far apart should these buildings actually be. Next, we'll talk about transportation and how to incorporate that into your skyline through bridges, ports, seaplane bases, ferry terminals, train stations, all that good stuff. After that, I'll briefly mention filler buildings because those are important as well. Not every building can stick out. And finally, when you should use repetition in your skyline and how to vary it so it's not super boring and that you can actually make your Minecraft city stand out from all those other ones. So if you're ready to no longer be a disappointment to every single person in your life, keep watching. Okay, let's start it off by talking about the location of your tall buildings. How do you actually know where to put them? So I have two methods for you that I want to talk to you about. The first one is the line method. The second one is the cluster method. And the third, you can combine the two, but we're going to talk about the two first. So first, the line method. What you're going to do, you're going to take a piece of paper. You are going to roughly draw out your landscape from a satellite view. And then what you're going to do is where you want your tallest skyscrapers, you are going to draw a line. I like to call this the skyline line. The idea being where you draw this line, that's where your tall skyscrapers are going to be. If we head to the city of Andia on Cubed Community and go to Northern Marina, we can see that I have a skyline line. And if we head northwest to the neighborhood of Monstera, we can also see a similar concept. Now when you draw one line and then build your skyscrapers along that line, that skyline is going to look really great from a couple angles. But if you look at it from head on, it's going to look a little skimpy. So what you're going to want to do is add a second line. This way you have a line of skyscrapers going one way and then one a second. Ideally, if you can have these two lines intersecting, then it's going to make for a really cool skyline. Now that you have two skyline lines, you can stand pretty much anywhere in your city and it's going to look really, really good. For example, if you stand in this area, it's going to look like your skyline goes all the way around you. Versus if you only have one skyline line, then it's not going to look as good. So that's the first method. The second method is the cluster method, which basically means put all your skyscrapers in kind of a blob. Now, if you start with the line method and you really, really love to make skyscrapers, eventually it's probably just going to turn into the cluster method where you just keep building skyscrapers. And that's okay, that's how cities evolve. One example of this is Lower Manhattan and Midtown Manhattan separately. They all have clusters of skyscrapers. If we head to Cubed Community, we can head to the city of Everton, and they also use the cluster method. The cluster method is best applied when you're on a peninsula and you can't really go anywhere else. So you build up. So that's the line and cluster method. Now the third method is a combination of two of them. And when you combine two of them, it starts to look really, really good. Now if we head to Google Earth and take a look at Vancouver, we can see there's two distinct lines of skyscrapers that intersect in the downtown area. Next, we'll talk about the building height variation. If you're not familiar with buildings, which I hope most of you probably should be, but I'm going to tell you anyway, you can categorize most buildings into three different categories: low rises, mid-rises, and high-rises. Low-rises are low, mid-rises are mid, and high-rises are high. Now the idea here is that you should use a combination of all three of these types to create your ideal skyline. Just be warned, if you have a really dense city and you have all high rises, you don't have any low rises, it's just really, really tall buildings, you're not gonna have any daylight on your streets, and that's not gonna be good, unless you're building Coruscant from Star Wars. New York City did have this problem, and then they introduced zoning or setbacks or something. I don't know, I'm not an urban planner. If you have all tall buildings, then it's really gonna be a struggle to get daylight on your streets, which is not good because people need daylight, that's important. Now, New York figured this out a while ago because in Lower Manhattan, they built some pretty tall buildings, and then one of the streets just did not get any sunlight throughout the entire year. So Yeah, just be careful of that. Now, typically, this is really only an issue if you have a really, really dense urban area. However, if you look at a place like Metrotown in Burnaby, you can see there's a lot of skyscrapers, but mostly houses around it. So instead of being a gradient up to the skyline, it seems like flat and then whoa. There are pros and cons to this. Usually, this only develops because you have houses that are pre-existing, and then the skyscrapers are built afterwards around transit corridors. Because in Metrotown, right through the middle, you have the SkyTrain and then a very central train station. Now, another thing to note is if you only have short buildings, you're not going to get very much of a skyline. Now, if you have a bunch of medium density buildings, that's okay too, but you're not really going to get that big skyline to it. However, this is really good urbanism, assuming you do the rest of the stuff too. But in general, like if you look at Montreal, they have a lot of mid-rise buildings, and this concept is very common in Europe as well, but if you really, really want that skyline, consider adding some high-rises. The key to a great skyline is having a gradient that goes from your really, really tall buildings and then slowly tapers down to the mid and low rises. Now, it doesn't have to be like one building after the other. In fact, that would probably look pretty stupid, but you need to be careful with the spacing as well, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Another thing to consider is if you have one really tall building and then the rest of your buildings are kind of short, it's going to make it look a little bit disproportionate. However, in cities like Toronto with the CN Tower and Seattle with the Space Needle, they have these really tall buildings, even though I guess the Space Needle isn't as tall as the rest of downtown, but you get the picture. These iconic buildings are not surrounded by skyscrapers. You have the iconic building, and then beside it, you have the rest of downtown. So instead of competing for that height, they sort of complement each other. If we take a look at the skyline of Manhattan, you will see that there's a lot of variation in the width of buildings. Now, of course, especially with Billionaires Row, they have a lot of super tall, slender towers, but a lot of the buildings are office towers from the 60s, 70s, 80s that are really thick and have a lot of floor space. Typically for office buildings, you're going to see a lot wider floor plates, and then for residential, they're going to be a lot smaller because if you have a smaller floor plate, that means you can get more windows per floor. Not more windows per floor, but more windows per square foot on each floor. Does that make sense? Basically, you don't want to have a giant floor plate for a condo building because, like, if you're in the middle here, you don't have any daylight. You want to be out by the windows. That's what I'm sort of trying to get at. Another thing to be careful of is the width of your skyline, because if you have like 6 or 7 tall skyscrapers right here, and then it drops off immediately, that's gonna look kind of weird. So ideally, if you're designing a city, try to taper it off and blend it down. Next, let's talk about the geometric shape of buildings, because that is important depending on the surroundings of your city. As a general rule of thumb, if my city that I'm designing has a landscape that I'm trying to blend it into, I try to use soft corners and more rounded buildings. However, if your city is man-made and the geography is quite flat, so something like New York, you might want to go for more of a man-made look where you have really rectangular and maybe even angular buildings as well. You can also break any rule that I say in this video because nothing matters. Who cares? Anyway, here's some special buildings to spice up your skyline, because I know you definitely need it. First, you can have historic buildings. So for example, maybe some Art Deco skyscrapers. Some examples include the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, both in New York. Another special building that you can use is a lookout tower. So you can do something like the Space Needle in Seattle or the Vancouver Lookout, which is a very popular tourist attraction. You can also have convention centers either along the water or in a place that's easily visible. You can also have an opera house like this one in Sydney or this one in the city of Andia. You can have a cruise terminal just like this one in Vancouver, and also just like this one in the city of Andia. Surprise, Andia's got some good stuff. And finally, I know this one isn't a building, but I didn't know where else to categorize it, but you can have a Ferris wheel, just like this one in the city of Andia. Next, let's talk about how to use nature to your advantage, because some of the best cities in the world do this very, very well. You can complement your city with water, hills, parks with trees. Trees are important. Use your trees. And even mountains if they're nearby. Pretty hard to import mountains. In New York, we can see this in action with Central Park. And by the way, I'm a direct descendant of the guy that designed Central Park, so that basically means I know what I'm talking about. Another great way to bring nature into your cities is by using trees along the streets. Get the really big trees, get them nice and fluffy so that it creates sort of this blanket. And finally, if you can build your downtown on a little bit of a slope, it's going to make it a lot more interesting to explore. And you can kind of build the buildings up as they go back. Okay, so next we're going to talk about skyscraper spacing, because it is important to figure out how far apart they should actually be. For office buildings, I would recommend an absolute minimum of 6 to 10 meters. However, ideally you should have the spacing equivalent to an entire skyscraper in between. For residential condos or apartments, I would recommend having the spacing of one building width between, because daylight is really, really important where people live. A great way to apply this is to do what Vancouver does. So what you're going to do is you're going to have a city block. On one side, you're going to have a tower. On the other side, you're also going to have a tower. And in the middle, you have a mid-rise connecting them, ideally with some townhouses. Now, these townhouses or row homes along the ground are great for families with kids, or maybe you have a dog. Because guess what? Not everybody wants to live in a condo, so by having this, it gives you more options. Next, let's talk about how to incorporate transportation into your skyline. And yes, it is actually quite easy to do this, the easiest way being bridges. Moving on transportation, you can also have a port, which I know is not the transportation of people, it is the transportation of goods. Now, the thing to be careful about with a port is that it should be separated from your city a little bit if you can. And the reason for this is ports make a lot of noise, and if you put a port beside a residential area, the residents are not going to like it. Another idea for transportation is to have a seaplane base just like here in Vancouver. Now, this is quite rare around the world, but it is a pretty cool idea. Something else you can have is a central train station attached to your transportation network through either light rail or heavy rail, and if it's along the water, you can connect it to a ferry terminal to go to different parts of your city. You could even build one of those train turntables like they have here in Vancouver called the Roundhouse. It's pretty cool. I actually made a building in an idea based off of it. Next, we're going to talk about filler buildings because not every building should stand out. If you design every building to be iconic, then none of them are iconic. The idea is to be able to build normal looking buildings relatively quick. So I'm not going to go too in depth, but if you would like to learn more about that, go check out this video. Essentially, you're going to build a handful of templates and then you can expand or contract, change the materials, change the roof, change the base. And instead of having 1,000 different buildings, you can have maybe 3 different types, change the properties of it, and now it looks like you have 1,000 different buildings. And finally, let's talk about repetition in skylines because sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't. Here's how to deal with it. First, let's talk about the 3 parts of any high-rise building. You have the base, middle, and top. The idea is to make them architecturally distinct from each other so that any person can look at it and say, that's the bottom, that's the middle, that's the top. Because if you're missing any one of these 3, your building is not going to look complete. So when you're designing your skyline, the top part is very, very important. And an easy way to make it look distinct from the rest of the building is to add parapets or logos on corporate buildings or even on hotels as well. Next, if you're working on a residential condo or apartment building, you can change up the middle by having different balcony designs. This doesn't necessarily mean that it has to look all crazy, but if you want to do some kind of cool designs, maybe something a little bit organic, then it's going to look pretty cool. It's going to spice up your skyline. My favorite example of this is One Bloor in Toronto. It has sort of an organic curve to it. It's very, very cool. And speaking of organic curves, I don't know if any curves are organic because buildings are not organic, but whatever, you get the idea. You can change the entire shape of the building if you would like. One example of this is Vancouver House in Vancouver's Yaletown. It looks like it's going to fall over, but it's definitely not. I would actually argue that it's more structurally not safe. They're all safe. I don't know what I'm saying, but basically there's less of the building to hold up, so it should theoretically make it safer. I don't know. I didn't design it. An example of this in-game is in the city of Andia in the neighborhood of Monstera. Here's a really cool building that I made using ovals. I thought it was pretty cool. You can also add patterns on the side of your building, either in the shape of lines, graffiti, or artwork. These 2 condos in Yaletown do a fantastic job in this department. Congratulations, you now know how to design a skyline that doesn't look like complete garbage, and your parents no longer have to be disappointed in you. Or maybe they will be. They probably will be, but oh well, that's your problem.